Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. Hey y'all, Kelly here. This episode of the podcast features a conversation with Tamara Wilder, and she's based out of Ukiah, California. Tamara has been teaching various ancestral skills from wild foods prep, primitive fire making, hide tanning, cordage, and a ton more for several decades. She co-wrote the book Braintanning, The Art of Buckskin with Steven Edholm, who was a podcast guest a couple episodes ago on bark tanning leather. She also co-runs the organization Paleotechnics with Steven. Paleotechnics functions as an educational resource on the art of simple, ancient, and universal ancestral technologies. Tamara teaches and travels all over the west coast of Turtle Island, and usually part of the year she's found somewhere facilitating classes on any number of ancestral technology skills. She's often found with suitcases full of cordage samples from Turtle Island, but also all over the world, and I find it really fascinating to see her collection and display, and it's really educational and amazing to be able to touch and see all of these different cordage samples. She also sometimes has with her wild food preparations like bay nut truffles that are amazing, and I tend to eat too many of them when I see her, and then I'm up all night. Fire making supplies for friction fire and bow drill, and primitive tools to teach others how to use them. She also carries tons of books and pamphlets around with her to share on all matter of skills related to permaculture, ancient living skills, crafts, and so much more. I've assisted teaching her before, and I really appreciate her attention to detail and what care she puts into her teaching and the love she has of sharing these skills with others and empowering folks to be more directly connected with our natural environment. We sat down this past spring. I house sat for her a little bit in Ukiah, which was really sweet, and before she parted ways from the land, we had a morning coffee date and recorded this podcast. I really hope I can sit down with Tamara again and do more episodes with her because I really appreciate her perspective. So in this conversation with Tamara, we talk about defining ancient technologies and how many are universal and how others are regionally specific, the importance and abundance of wild foods in Northern California. We speak a little bit on bay nuts, madrone berries, manzanita berries, and acorns, which are all wild foods in Northern California. Mast years with certain wild foods, including this past year's huge bay nut crop. The importance of acorn processing to the cultural identity of many indigenous folks in Northern California. How Tamara went from punk rock vegan to teaching about animal processing. The ancestral relationship many folks have around the world historically to consuming animals. We speak a little bit on the legal issues around picking up roadkill and why there are laws making it illegal in some states. And just to be clear, we're not advocating people pick up roadkill in this episode, but we just discuss the way that it's approached in our culture and the ways that may be changing. We speak on how abalone is poached and overharvested, the historical wild management practices of indigenous folks in Northern California, like controlled burns, and the importance of these practices to ecological health, and of course cultural health. How overpopulation affects the ability for humans to live in balance with the land. We speak a little bit on Tamara's teachers, which some of them include Jim Riggs, Margaret Mathewson, and Melvin Beatty. We speak a little bit on fiber and cordage as pandemic technologies and dogbane's importance as a superior fiber plant that grows across Turtle Island. So the book that Steven and Tamara wrote on Braintanning Buckskin is technically out of print right now, even though it's a really popular book and a really great resource. And part of the problem, both Steven mentioned a little bit in his episode and Tamara mentions a tad bit in her episode, just the difficulties they've had in reprinting it because of their former printer throwing away their slides, and that was an old way of creating books, using a film-like process to lay out the book. So they're working on orienting and laying out the book. But if anyone has any resources on helping them expedite that process, feel free to contact either of them. I'm sure that they appreciate any kind of push to do that, because I know a lot of people would really like that book. You can support Tamara on Patreon, and that's one way that you can help give her more financial space to spend time like doing the stuff with the book, because she teaches a lot and that's her livelihood, and that enables her to be able to do what she does. So I think giving her more financial space to work on that book would be a great thing. So I also included in the show notes a link to a book called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, which we mentioned some information from that book in this episode that you're about to listen to, and it's just a great book. So I really highly recommend looking into that book. With that, let's go ahead and listen to this conversation with Tamara. Happy listening, y'all. Burn, burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn, burn with the heat that will warm these places.
My name is Tamara Wilder, and we are sitting right now in the Coast Ranges of Northern California, west of the town of Ukiah, California, off of a little road called Ore Springs Road. And it's a beautiful piece of property that I've been really fortunate to have been able to be involved in for the last 12 years, I think it is now.
Awesome. And so what is the Paleotechnics project, and maybe you can define that for us and explain how that started.
Okay, yeah. The word Paleotechnics actually came out of a really old Putnam's word dictionary from the 1920s, and it was in a time when we were trying to figure out. I mean, when I say we, I mean my business partner and my ex-partner Steven Edholm and I. This was over 20 years ago. We were trying to figure out a name for our business. We'd already been teaching ancient living skills, and we'd been going to gatherings, and we'd been doing workshops, but we were actually trying to found a business and get a business license and be moving forward, and we needed a name. And a lot of people were using different combinations of ancient or aboriginal or aborigine or skills, different things like that. And we were sort of looking up synonyms to those kinds of words. And there was this thing about paleo. Well, first there was the word technics. And then I can't remember if it was actually that we put the word paleo on there, or in one of the old, I think in that one, they had put the paleo in front of technics, meaning ancient arts and technologies. So technics is basically arts and technologies, and paleo literally means ancient. And so it really applies really well to everything that we're doing. It's not specifically anything, it's just the ancient, the beginning of everything. And I really like using the word paleo as opposed to other words like primitive or other words like aborigine or aboriginal, because there's all sort of these negative connotations that come around with those words. And it can trigger people, and I feel like paleo really describes much more what I'm doing, and I like that it sort of brings in a little bit more of a scientific aspect to it. And so I fell in love with the word right away and decided to make it my company name. And then now, 20 plus years later, it's actually, people congratulate me that it's been branded, because people use the word Paleotechnics to describe the whole field now.
The process of the simple technologies that you teach.
Right, or just practicing the ancient living skills. Like, people just use the word as a, and it is a word that means that. It just wasn't a commonly used word before, and we sort of resurrected it, I feel like, by finding that old combination and thinking it was a good thing. Mm-hmm. So people use paleotechnologies a lot, but the actual Paleotechnics is the word that wasn't really getting used before.
So you and Steven, and he's still involved, but mainly it's your project now.
Yeah. Technically it's a partnership, and he has a whole channel called Skill Cult now, and that's really his individual project. And then Paleotechnics, anything new from Paleotechnics is pretty much me, but technically he co-wrote a lot of the old things, and he co-founded the company, and so he's still a minority, a minor partner in the whole project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, and you've explained before that you often focus on through the Paleotechnics project technologies that are universal among all humans that we like anyone as human could have a connection to.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I focus on as much as possible in what I do. I call them the pandemic universal human heritage skills and knowledge, and they're not regional specific. They're not race specific. They're not tribal specific. The core, what I call them, the roots of the tree of technology, are the core things, and they're going back over 1,000,000 years, 1.5 million years. Like they keep pushing the dates further and further back, but it's the core base things that are like making fire, utilizing fire as a tool, making string, figuring out fiber arts, figuring out how to process animal skin so that you can, preserve it and make it into clothing, figuring out hunting technologies. Like all those things are so ancient, and every human that's alive on the earth today has ancestors who were good at these things, starting way back, because if they hadn't have figured out how to do those things, they wouldn't have survived, and we would not be here today. And so that's what I tend to do is really focus on the core pandemic universal things. There are regional specialties that come in. I do live in Northern California, and right now this land we're sitting on is Pomo country. The tribe that has lived here for many thousands of years is Pomo. There's a lot of different bands of Pomo. It's not really a tribe. It's more of like a classification of language families, or like language groups. But, this is the area, the region where the Pomo languages have been spoken. And so in that, I've spent a lot of time here. And so there are certain regional things that I'll bring in that are really specific, that I do attribute to like Pomo traditions. But I'm not doing anything like a Pomo tradition. I don't teach native traditions. I'll use modern examples of something that somebody's using in a specific place, usually because I think that if they're incredibly brilliant, or they're incredibly beautiful, or they're incredibly unique, and that they're almost always tied to those core base technologies. It's like I talk about, this is the modern example of something that we have been doing for a very long time. Like there's a very specific wild food that grows here that I have been processing for the last 20 years. And it's the bay nuts, the roasted bay nuts, yeah. And that's a very specific. It's not Pomo specific, but it's a very specific thing to Northern California and Southern Oregon. It's the bay laurel tree, or myrtle wood as it's called. It's also called pepperwood in certain parts. It's interesting. It's bay laurel in the southern part of California. As you get into Northern California, they start calling it pepperwood. And then as you get into Oregon, they start calling it myrtle wood. So it's all the same tree. And then the nuts can be roasted, and they have a stimulating quality to them, much like coffee or dark chocolate. And they're a really, really regional food that was really important. And it also is really important in modern days because it's super prolific, super abundant, and it's a way that people can still have a sort of roasted, stimulating treat without supporting, coffee processing that gets imported from other parts of the world, without having like a lot of people use it as a substitute when they don't want to be eating coffee or chocolate anymore, or purchasing that. So it's a way to still get that thing that we like so much from those roasted, stimulating things from a local food. And, for that reason, it's something that I feel like is really important, because one of the things I totally believe is that the way to get people to start, or one of the ways, there's lots of ways of doing things, there's never only one way, but a really great way to get people to appreciate the natural world around them is introduce them to ways that they can interact with it, especially ways that they can eat it. Like if you can get people to eat the plants that are growing around them, it develops a really intimate connection.
The taste, the primal sensation of taste.
Yeah, and just like it's nourishing you, it's giving you something. And especially if there's so many wild foods, people have this image, if they haven't done wild foods, they have this thing that wild foods are not going to taste good, or that they're just going to be like survival. But when you have things like the bay nuts or the manzanita berries, or here in California, our wild foods are so abundant and so tasty and so just like fun to eat. Acorns are even really delicious,
acorns.
So many acorns. And it's we have such an abundance of food here, and it's the reason why people have flourished here and thrived here for so many thousands of years. This has always been a very abundant place to live. Life has always been really good. What I like to tell people is that like people that lived in this area have always been really rich, have always been like, really, they've had everything they needed. Like, there's not very many stories of famines, there's not very many stories of really hard times of not having food. And so, as compared to other parts of the world and the country. And so, we have so much to offer here. And by introducing people to foods that taste good, that especially like the bay nuts that are so much like coffee and chocolate, it just sort of, blows people's minds, and it makes them more wanting to explore further. And so that's one of the reasons that I love it. And I also like having a stimulant sometimes. And so, the bay nuts are, and it's an art form also. It's just like making like a fine chocolate or making a good coffee. You have to know how to roast them. People develop a skill. People get a reputation for doing it. It's not something that's easy to do, but it's something that was definitely really commonly done all over Northern California, and it's just a really, really awesome local thing. Yeah.
And bay nuts, like acorns, have mast years too, right? Where they have big years. Like this past year was a big year. Yeah.
This past year with the bay nuts was the biggest mast year I've ever seen for the bay nuts. I've never seen anything like it before. And most people were talking that they haven't. But generally they go on about a 3 or 4 year cycle. So next year I'm expecting, like 3 years ago was a pretty big year. Last year there was hardly anything. The year before, this last fall, and then this last fall was totally amazing.
Like you couldn't collect all of
them. Oh no,
but
people. Like... I walked up to trees, and where friends of mine live, and I say, "Oh, you didn't pick up any bay nuts?" And they say, "No, I gathered 200 pounds of bay nuts from this tree," and it still looked like it was completely covered on the floor. And that's how it was all over the whole northern state. It was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and those are the years when you want to harvest as many as you can, because you're not over harvesting, you're not taking, there's going to be plenty for all the wild animals, and that's when you try to harvest as much as you can, because you can store them for 3, 4, 5 years. You store them in the shell, unroasted, and if you dry them properly, they're really stable. And then you just roast them as you're going to eat them.
I often think about the tree or the plant as like wanting, it's like, hey, we want you to eat this, like we're offering a lot for you this year, the squirrels too, or whatever other animals eat it, and then there's so many also to be planted, and it's just like such an amazing relationship.
It's super great that way, and that happens with a lot of the nut plants, with a lot of the acorns, with a lot of the things. The one interesting thing, almost everything, domestic and native wild plants, almost everything had really abundant years last fall. Like the grape harvest, people were talking about it was epic. It was massed. It was so many massed years. I heard about it almost everything. The one thing that didn't bear last year was madrone berries. It was one of the worst years I've seen.
Yeah, I noticed that.
But this year, the flowering that just happened 2 or 3 weeks ago is the most flowers I've ever seen on madrones ever. So I feel like the madrones are going to be like 1 year behind, and they're going to have a massed year this year, as long as nothing happens with the flowering, which it's been incredible weather during this flowering. So I think they're all going to set really well. But you can't even, when you look at the madrone trees right now, you don't see anything but white. You don't see the green at all.
Wow.
They've been covered in flowers. It's been crazy.
That's awesome. They're great for food and for decoration and jewelry and stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The madrone berries are another thing that I love. I sort of liken them. You can eat them fresh, but they have a little bit of a tart, acrid thing to them when they're fresh. They're a relative of manzanita berries, which is another amazing thing that you can make it's like emergency or like high C or emergency drink. It's a powder that's pure vitamin C, and you mix it with water. But the manzanita berries, that's the manzanita berries, but the madrone berries, they don't have that powdery center to them. They're just sort of a juicy berry, but they're a pretty dry berry. And when you eat them fresh, they're a little bit acrid, but...
more neutral than manzanita.
They're just...
Neutral acrid.
Yeah, they're sort of like, I don't know, they have this little thing. If you eat a lot of them, you can get it on the back of your throat. It's totally fine to eat a handful, but if you're eating like a whole meal of them or something. But once you dry them, they're really good, and they're very nourishing. They're not sweet, and they I sort of liken them. I think they're the closest wild thing that we have in Northern California that's sort of like a goji berry. It gets that same sort of kind of feeling, like you're feeling nourished by it. It feels, and they do have a fair amount of vitamin C in them, and they're a really good staple berry. They're not like huckleberry, which is super sweet and and just like super powerful food, but they're sort of this just things you can just munch on. And I discovered how good of a food they are because I do string them and make them into garlands, and then I cut them into necklace links, and I sell them at holiday fairs because they're a red berry and they look like a mala, or they look like a they're a beautiful thing. People use them for meditation mallas. That's what sometimes I make those too. And when I would be cutting the garlands, because I string them into garlands to dry them, and then when I'm putting them into shorter lengths, I need to cut them. And then I need to pull, 3 or 4 or 5 off of each end so that I can tie the strings together. And I would always put those in a little bowl, and then I would just snack on them at craft fairs. When I wouldn't have enough food and I'd be working and I'd be busy. And I'd realize by the end of the day that I'd hardly eaten, but I didn't feel hungry or at all. Like I felt like I had been nourished. And I realized, well, I was just eating these drone berries all day. And so that was when I really started paying attention to how nourishing of a food they are. So.
Wow. And do you collect acorns usually?
I try to. Acorns are something that I collect and then I often don't get around to harvesting because to processing. I'm on the road so much that it's something that I definitely wish I could process more.
It's like a bigger process than
you have to have more tools. It's more of a process, yeah, and it's, you need to be able to leach them. There's a whole process, and I've done it a fair amount, but it's always been something that I wanted to have more of my regular thing, and I think when I'm no longer nomadic and living more a sedentary life, it's going to become part of my diet.
That's something I didn't realize coming from the east. There's oaks there too, and people have collected acorns there, but it's so much more. We know a lot more about the ways that indigenous people have and do live in California compared to the East Coast, but like oaks are like...
Oh, they're solid, yeah.
The center of everything.
Oh, they are, and there's so many Native people, modern day Native people, who still eat acorn regularly and process acorn regularly. It's a huge part of a cultural identity in Northern California. And that's part of why I don't teach it a lot. And I don't, I mention to people, eating acorns is great, but it's not something, because I feel like I don't want to be, treading in that way at all. I pick things, I tend to, I pick things that I feel like are really unique, and the things that I teach that are somewhat culturally specific or regional specific, I'm picking them and I'm choosing them because I feel like they're not being shared by very many people, or they're really unique. Like there's a shuttle design of a net of a net making shuttle that is a pommel style shuttle of a split oak shoot.
Oh yeah.
And it's one of my favorite ones to teach because it's definitely a very specific design, but it's a unique example of using a stick and shaping green wood and shaping it and binding it and having it seasoned, and then you sand it, and it makes this really completely incredibly elegant shuttle, which is different. You don't have to carve it like you have to do with most other shuttle designs. And that's definitely a very culturally specific thing that I found, I first found out from Pomo ethnobotanies and from Pomo stories and from examples in museums and things. And then I figured out how to make them, and that was a very long time ago. But that's another Pomo thing that I do teach, but it's something that isn't really commonly represented. And I feel like when I'm teaching that kind of a thing, I'm helping people understand the ingenuity and the beauty and the technical advancements of our local Native culture that isn't maybe getting appreciated until they really understand the Pomo designs, especially that shuttle. They're incredible, and the basketry in this area was over the top. The amount of skill that people had and do still possess is people just don't even understand that. And so I try to, I do these pandemic programs where I'm really focusing on the skills, but I feel like if I can bring in an example from, not always here, but since I live here, that quite a few of them are from here, an example of where people have taken that to a completely amazing level. It lets people appreciate sort of the timeline in it and the skill required. But it's always a dance on what I'm going to share and what I'm not going to share. And acorn is one of those ones that I haven't felt like I wanted to leap into because it is being shared so commonly and it's such a cultural identity that I feel like there's not a need for me to be talking about acorn or doing acorn with people, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So you teach stuff about cordage and fiber. You do animal processing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you teach high tanning, or you teach?
I used to.
You used to teach it more.
Yeah, I used to do. I co-wrote a book with Steven Edholm called Buckskin, the Ancient Art of Braintanning. And I used to teach 1 to 2 tanning classes a year until about 7 years ago when I had an arm injury and I needed to stop teaching it. And then I just haven't picked it back up again. Tanning is a hard work. Teaching a tanning class is really hard work. And I just turned 50. And there's a whole generation of younger tanners, who a lot of them learned from either me or from students of mine, and I feel like they're in my lineages and they can teach the classes now. But there is talk. A couple of them are talking about co-teaching with me, and it would be really fun to co-teach with a younger instructor who could take on a bunch of the physical.
You don't have to do as much of the
I don't have to do
hard
much
labor.
of the physical hard labor, but then I can be giving my inputs and my, like my expertise and my knowledge. I'm liking the idea of doing that. Because carrying, even 7 years ago, carrying a whole tanning class by yourself I was like, I'm getting a little bit old for this maybe. It's just a lot of physical work, so.
So you teach animal processing still.
Yeah.
Using the whole animal is like something that which you will teach with domestic animals or wild animals.
I don't. I almost never do it with wild animals.
Oh.
Because just in a classroom situation, you can't ever know you're going to have the animal, and then there's also legal problems with that.
Deer and stuff.
Well, you don't ever want to be with. So Fish and Game law is like any game animal, which would be anything that you have to have a hunting license to hunt, or a tag or a tag to get, which you have to have both for deer and things like that. Those animals are considered to be sport hunting animals, and they really intentionally, in order to keep them from being overhunted, there's huge laws against market hunting, and so you're never allowed to sell any of those parts.
It's a lot of places.
And so if you are charging somebody to take a class, and they're paying you, and then you're utilizing a wild animal, you're sort of running the edge of breaking the law. And then also just the timing, like you can't guarantee that animal's going to be there. Because with animal processing, you want to be, especially if you're using all the parts, you want to have killed that animal right before like moments before you're starting the whole process. So I don't think I've ever actually taught on an official class with a wild animal. But what I do is I use locally raised domestic animals, and they're fairly similar. So they really, people can learn, and they can, move on to, they can apply, like from processing a goat, you really can. It's almost the same as a deer.
Apply it to any deer.
You can apply it to any deer. And so when I do animal processing classes, I tend to do a goat or a sheep, and that, runs towards like, deer, elk, like any of those guys. And then I'll do a rabbit, and that would apply for smaller animals, like any of the fur bearers. So I'll do domestic rabbits, and then I'll do chickens, and that's fowl. Like any of the birds are essentially the same. We're way more related. Animals are more related and have more in common than different, especially with animal processing. Once you've done an animal in that same group, even if you've done any animal, you can imply a lot, but if you've done one animal in that same grouping, you'll be able to move forward, and it's basically the same. And then the one animal that is very different, and around here we have wild pigs, and they're definitely very different because they're omnivores, not herbivores. And they've got a totally different skin, and they're just a very different animal. And so I will do classes with domestic pigs. And a lot of the people that take my classes are hunters who want to know how to process the wild pigs when they get them. So.
And you teach trying to utilize as many parts of the animal as possible.
Yeah, I call it like a nose to tail workshop. And so with the pigs especially, pigs are incredibly edible animals. Pretty much eat almost everything on the pig. I think one of the only things we don't eat are the teeth and the hair and the hooves themselves. And then the hooves can be made into rattles or made into decorations, and the teeth can be used as tools and things like that. But pretty much with the pigs we eat everything else. And then with deer and goats, there's a little bit less that's edible. The skin isn't as edible with the herbivores. Pig skin is just this sort of thing that's really good for eating, but we can when I'm working with the deer or goats, we just do more utilitarian stuff. So we eat as much as possible, and then we make tools with the rest. Anything we don't eat, we make tools with.
Wow, you teach that sometimes outside of the ancestral skills community too, right? You said you sometimes teach in this area, and there's like a chef, and do you really like cook up really good food with all the parts? And I think that's a really cool way to create accessibility with these things, because it can be really intimidating sometimes from a distance. Like, how do I even begin? But it's like connection to food is such a huge way.
That's basically what got me going. Is at the beginning I was just teaching. The way it worked for me, my history is sort of interesting on that. Is in high school, I grew up in Los Angeles, in suburban Los Angeles, and even though my father was a hunter and a fisherman, he wasn't hunting. He had hunted before I was born. He would hunt regularly with his family, but he fished during my growing up a lot, and so I grew up fishing with him and gutting fish, and and he he put a lot of the meat that was on our table, like, was from his fishing trips and then his, his family's hunting trips and things. But then when I was in junior high school and high school, we were still buying a lot of meat, or my friends were too. And I sort of I got into punk rock, and I got into anarchism stuff, and I got into animal rights things, and I became a pretty intense animal rights, like, vegan person, punk rock person. Like, I loved the band Crass, and, like, it was all this, like, whole thing in the 80s. And so I remember my dad went hunting at one point and got a deer, and I came home and I lectured him that he shouldn't have been hunting a deer. He likes to laugh about that now. But, it was part of my process, because I was coming through and just trying to figure out, I definitely didn't like the whole mass production of meat, and I didn't want to be eating animals that had been raised in factory farm things. And, but then I also, by the time I got into college and moved up to UC Santa Cruz, I also realized that I'm of really pretty heavy northern Scandinavian and northern European ancestry, and I don't do well on a vegan or vegetarian diet. I need to have some fat. I need to have some animal, like milk and dairy, I do great with, and meat I do great with. It's not that I have to have a lot of it. I just have to have a little bit of it regularly. And, and then especially even, not having much money and dumpster diving and trying to live really, I didn't have enough money to eat a vegan diet, but then I also didn't want to be eating the store-bought vegan diet, because there's such a heavy footprint in all of these hugely processed foods that people do.
Substitutes.
These meat substitutes, and especially, back in the early 90s, it isn't like is now. There wasn't as much available. But I still do believe that, when we eat animals, they're eating a lot of the greens and the grass and the things that we can't personally eat. And they're eating it, and they're making it into a very nutrient-dense thing for us to consume. And our bodies really like it. I mean, we've been hunters. The whole thing, our paleo ancestors were hunter-gatherers. We've been hunters for millions of years. And we had to figure out how to become hunters, because we don't have the tools on our bodies. We don't have sharp teeth and claws. But those were some of the earliest technologies that we figured out, was how to make hunting tools, how to figure out how to make a rabbit stick, how to throw a hand spear, how to throw a rock even, and we probably were defending ourselves from animals, and then realized that we're trying to hunt us, and then we realized that we could use these tools we'd created to hunt animals and kill them. And so we've been eating animals for a long time, and I feel like for most of us, there's some people that maybe that's not true with. There's some blood type stuff that people are talking about, but for type O people, eating a certain amount of animal flesh is really nourishing. And if you're looking at your local footprint, eating either local wild animals or animals that you've raised on a small scale, like homestead situation, is going to have way less of a footprint and actually have less death attached to it than buying, tofu from the store, or buying some heavily processed thing from the store that's been transported halfway around the country. Like, if you start looking at the number of animals that have died in the growth and transport of vegan foods, as opposed to an animal that's eating, that's keeping your grass around your homestead down so that you're not going to get hit by a big wildfire. Like, they're doing a double duty. They're helping clear the grass for you. They're keeping, this fire load down. They're browsing the trees around you to keep the fire load down, if they're goats. And then they're also serving you food, and you might even be getting goat milk from them. But then, in the process of raising an animal for goat milk, you have these boys that are born that you can't keep them all, because you only need to have one male in a goat herd. And so you raise them up, you give them a really good life, they're fine, but then one day you kill them and they're really nourishing. And there's lots of parts of the world where people do that with goats, and I feel like they're a very sustainable way of raising meat on a small scale. But if you take it into mass marketing or mass production, factory farming, that turns into a completely different thing. So I feel like it's how you raise the animals, the life you give them, and how you're integrating them into the things that you need done in your local area. Then that becomes where raising animals is not a detriment, it's actually a benefit. And then you can be nourished off of it as well. So that's what I started doing, was looking at the footprint. And in college, I really started, but I hadn't gotten to domestic animals yet at that point, and it was just that I was finding roadkills in Northern California. And I was really anemic, I wasn't eating well, I was living off $20 a month, basically, riding a bicycle and dumpster diving, and, and then we'd get a roadkill, and after eating that roadkill for a couple of weeks until it was gone, realizing, whoa, I feel really good, and started realizing how important meat was for my general health. And I did that for years, where I would only eat roadkills, or I would, clean roadkills. I learned how to identify them, new ones that weren't rotten. I felt like I was making a really good judgment. And riding a bicycle, you run into them and see them more than when you're in a car. And then I started eating hunted animals, were hunters that I thought they were doing a really good job. And that was especially gatherings. I'd get fed hunted animal meat by people. And then when I moved to Northern California, there was this whole growth of people wanting to do local dairies, local goat dairies or local cow dairies even, but usually goat dairies. And there was this problem where they would get the idea they wanted to make cheese or have dairy goats. And then they would get several years in and get to the point where one of their male kids needed to go away, because they'd realized they'd have 4 male kids, and they were, getting to be 10 months to a year old or whatever. And they'd say, wow, we can't keep feeding this animal that's actually causing a problem, because we only need to have 1 male buck. And then they would call me up and say, hey, do you have any idea how I can kill this goat? Because they'd realized that they'd gone into this whole thing but didn't know how to kill the animals they were raising. And it would be a learning thing for them, and it was part of a learning thing for me, where I was, at the time, living a little bit more close to town at the time, was unable to hunt and find animals as much, and wasn't riding my bike as much in Mendocino County, so I wasn't finding as many roadkills as in Santa Cruz area. And and I was like, oh, well, this is a great source of food. And so I started doing trade with people, where they'd have a couple goats to kill, and I'd go and do a little class with them. And we'd kill 2 goats, and they'd give me 1. And then we'd eat that for a while. And, and so then I got into oh, yeah, this is how you effectively kill a domestic animal. And then after a few years of doing that, people started saying, oh, you should do classes on this. We all need to learn how to do this.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Well, I have many thoughts on what you just said, but how do you pick up a roadkill deer with a bike?
Well, that would be mostly it would be like you would just pull it off the side of the hill.
Yeah. And
you take the parts you wanted.
Right, because sometimes you don't want to take the middle part, you just take the arms and legs.
Right, yeah, and especially if it had been really, usually we just pull out the cuts we wanted and skin it and take the skin, and we'd had really good panniers, and you'd pack it all in the panniers and then ride off with it. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes if it was where we were like, oh, this was just hit, it doesn't have any gut, because if the guts break, then a lot of the meat is not really going to be that usable anyways. But where we'd have gutted it or whatever, and we would look at it and say, this whole carcass is in beautiful shape. Then we would stash it and go borrow a car from somebody and then come back and get it. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways of doing it.
I've had some times where one person with a car, I can't lift the roadkill into the car. Right. So it's like, no.
But I should warn people that in most states in the United States, it is illegal to pick up roadkills. I don't see that there's any...
So we're not advocating for that. We can't.
Well, I don't see there being... It's definitely not morally a problem. And I like to clarify this with people. And it is, in a way, you could also see it as it's almost sort of morally an obligation. Like if you find a clean animal, at least pull it off the road. But if it's so freshly killed that you can utilize it in some way, I feel like it's totally morally a fine thing to do. The reason it's illegal is not the people. It's really my opinion. This is my opinion. Is not that people. It's not that authorities, wardens, and people that are doing game enforcement, it's not that they don't want people picking up roadkills. There's a little bit of a thing, like it might be a public health hazard if somebody doesn't understand. They pick up an animal that's too old, it might make them sick. Like there's a little bit around that, like this sort of safety issue. But most of it is that the problem is that Fish and Game law, the way they keep people from poaching animals, is that the possession of an animal is breaking the law if you don't have the proper tags or the proper licensing. And so just the possession, because they can't catch people poaching very often, but they can catch people in possession of the parts. And so that's why it's illegal, is that if you're in possession of an animal that you don't have the licensing to be able to do. And some states are remedying it. Like in Oregon, they've now made it case law that it's okay if you're, because people are like, this is ridiculous. All these animals get killed and we're not allowed to. So it's gone to court a couple times. And in the East Coast, there's so many animals getting killed because there's a deer population explosion that some of the states issue actual roadkill tag booklets, so you can just call the state, because Fish and Game is all by state, so you have to know what's going on in your state. There's game booklets or roadkill booklets. And the idea is that if you're poaching, you're not going to contact your local fish and game and tell them you're picking up roadkill. So when you pick up a roadkill, you tag it, just like you would, what if you hunted it, and you send it in to the fish and game department, and then it's legal. And that's the kind of thing. And then in Canada, I've been told that it's legal to pick up roadkills as long as you're not the person that hit it.
Oh,
so, and that's the thing that people say, that if it's legal to pick up roadkills, it would encourage people to hit animals with their cars, which is sort of a ridiculous argument, because you don't damage your car. You don't want to damage your car that much. Some people might do it, but it wouldn't be happening on a big scale. But that's why the rule in Canada is that way.
I know in some states, moose or elk or bigger animal like bear, you still have to call, but like it's such a huge animal with so much meat, and it's almost easier if and there might be a wait list, like, okay, if there's a moose.
Yeah,
like,
definitely in
like
Canada, you get on a wait list, and they'll even, a friend of mine lived up in Alaska, and you got on a wait list for moose that were getting hit by strains, and they would deliver the moose to your front yard with a big, like, backhoe thing. And if you were on the list, because they were like, we don't know what to do with these huge animals that are getting killed by the trains.
Someone knows how to deal with it.
Yeah, and this is a so every region does it differently, and you really want to know, and that's the other thing about it is so these are animals that if you have to have a hunting license and a tag to get them, they're going to be the ones that are illegal to possess. But if it's a varmint animal, which every state has different lists of which animals there are, in a lot of states coyotes are considered to be varmints, then there's going to be no problem picking it up. Raccoons are very similar in some states. So I'm not going to tell people what is what, but check out your state. Every state has a fish and game website, and they'll list the animals that are varmints, they'll list the animals that are controlled, they'll list the animals that are protected that nobody can possess. And, and then they'll list the ones that you have to have a trapping license to be able to hunt. So every animal's classified. And so it's going to be the legality or illegality of having it or picking it up is going to depend on the state you're in and what animal it is. And then there's another thing is that in the state of California, which is where I am, is technically the hide of the animal is not controlled, because you are allowed to sell the hides. Like it's in other states, it's different. Some states the hides are tagged and they're controlled, but in California the hide is not controlled. So technically you could pull the roadkill off of the side of because it's only illegal once you put it in your car. If you're just clearing it from the road, I don't know of any rules telling you can't do that, because that's all, you're helping by getting an animal off the road. And technically you could skin that animal, take the skin and put the skin in your car and not be breaking the law, because you can be in possession of a deer hide without a tag.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so but every other part would be a problem. And then the antlers too, if a shed antler you can legally be in possession of without a tag. So, there's little...
Because you could just find that in the woods,
right,
too.
Exactly. But if you have a sawed-off antler that they can see that it was attached to the skull, which it's got that rosette on the bottom, and it's sawed off, then you can't be in possession of that without a tag. Well, people give those away, so technically you could be, but you can't sell those. You can sell a shed antler, but you can't sell a cut-off antler. Then that's in the state of California. So like I said, every state is different. So you need to research your own state's laws. And then in California, we also have a thing which I can take advantage of is that as an educator, they have educator permits. And so you can get a permit to be picking up roadkills to use them for education purposes. So, but that you have to go and register with Fish and Game and do a whole process of applying for that. And then they're aware that you're doing what you're doing. They just don't want to think you're poaching. And I totally support Fish and Game laws. And I try to work with them as much as I possibly can, because without Fish and Game laws, we wouldn't have the wild animals we have.
The tragedy of the commons that I keep...
Yeah. It's, they've been protecting them since the 50s or since earlier than the 50s. If we didn't have Fish and Game laws, market hunting would have decimated all of our wild animal populations.
Which is unfortunate that humans tend to do stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I'm not saying Fish and Game is perfect. They've made their mistakes, but they do really try to manage. And I've worked with a lot of biologists over the years at different places where I'll skin deer for hunters. There's a lot of times biologists involved, and I've known a lot of Fish and Game wardens over the years, and I've known a lot of Fish and Game biologists over the years, and they all are doing it because they're trying to protect animals, and they have a lot to say. Like if they see a population they're tracking, they're looking at population densities, and if they see a population is getting overhunted by the hunting rules, they have the right to slow down the hunts. That's what's happening right now with the abalone. is, the abalone are starving because the urchins have taken over. The
Water
urchins have
flying,
the urchins, this one kind of urchin has exploded in population, probably because of the warm water. People don't know exactly why, but it's exploded and it's eaten all the kelp. And so now the abalone have no kelp to eat, and they're literally starving inside of their shells. So if you get a full-grown abalone, which used to be, full of meat, and there used to be so many of them that we could sport fish them, and there was a plenty good population. But now, if people are finding them, and they're basically starving to death. They're like a quarter of the size they should be inside of a big shell.
And that happened in a really short period of time.
Yeah, it's only happened in the last 2 or 3 years, and so they've pretty much shut down the whole abalone fishery right now. You can't sport fish abalone, or hardly at all anywhere, and that's because it's in response that these animals are starving. We can't be hunting them right now.
That's the traditional food of this area as well.
Oh, big time, yeah, because it's something you can pick. It's more like harvesting than hunting or fishing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a low tide. You can just walk up and pull them off the rocks.
Wow.
And they're delicious, and have always been a really important food source around here. But they got overhunted in Southern California, and they got closed. People were pretty much decimated the abalone populations in Southern California, and then they stopped allowing people to do it. And then it's been a sport thing up here where you get tags, and the prices have been going up, and the limits have been going down for years. Because they're trying to control it and keep things from getting hit. But then the biggest thing that's hitting the thing here in the old days before this happened and they shut everything down is that it was all free diving. So the abalone go way deeper than we can free dive. And so the idea was that there were always enough out there that we weren't going to destroy their populations, and free diving is a little more challenging.
Couldn't get to them.
Because humans couldn't get to the core populations. But people go in with scuba gear and for market poaching, and they'll go in and they'll take hundreds of abalone for restaurants and things. And that's where the majority of the fish and game things, they really regulate, they like really go to our coast and monitor our coast and try to catch the market poachers, because they're making a ton of money and they are really dramatically impacting the populations.
Cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinters. Forest elders breathe their last, I'll bring them for your supper. Every piece of wood I bring carries a story in lichen, fungus, beetles, maze. It's the same to you, all ablaze. When you burn, burn with the light of the morning's birth. Burn, burn with the heat at the heart of the earth. Burn, burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn, burn with the heat that will warm these places. Some may fear your endless greed, but not me. No, not me. Some may fear your appetite, but I'm at home in your life. Fiery fingers curling round, flaming tongues aflutter. Promise you will warm my bed. I horse on bended knee, so you will keep me company. I'll bring you branches, feed you logs, so soon this wood will all be gone. I'll build you a lovely home, I'll leave you lots of breathing room. Logs of locust, cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinters.
I have a lot of conflicting thoughts at times around the connection to wild foods and the lands or wild animals.
Mm-hmm.
And as humans, that's like a part of our ancestral lineage, like you were saying. Like,
Right.
It goes so far back that we've used simple tools to forage or to hunt for, and that's probably what makes us actually human beings.
Mm-hmm.
But we live in a reality now where the way that our culture is, the way that we like live with each other, is that we don't have like the foresight to see that like we might be making a huge impact long term. So there's certain things that you can't
You have to
really
make those
affect.
decisions.
Yeah, like bay nuts, I don't think you could possibly overdo it. Maybe at least right now, but like
On certain years you could.
Oh,
you know,
really?
well, you wouldn't impact the trees, but you might take them away from the other
other
animals. Like on lean years. I mean, that's like, and that's where all of this wisdom comes in. You know, and there's a great book called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson that she talks about that. And it's getting written around more and more. Is that all around the world, the indigenous peoples, they made mistakes. They over-harvested things in the past. This isn't a modern problem. It's a more prevalent modern problem because there's so many people and because of our lifestyle that we're doing, because we're impacting our environment. But these changes and these problems and these, like, populations have ebbed and flowed always. And so there's always stories. If you look back in anything, there's always going to be one or two stories about a time when people over-harvested something, even with indigenous lifestyles. And they had to adapt. And so that's where a lot of the rules, like if you look at any indigenous culture, there's going to be rules about harvesting, and a lot of that is coming out of this like multi-generational wisdom that has come in over thousands of years. Of like, we do this to make sure we're not going to over-harvest. Like, so there's all these rules, and that's the wisdom, and we can in our modern world still harvest and interact with our wild environment, but we have to be taking those things into consideration, and we have to realize that we are working with a much more imbalanced system than we've ever worked with before. So what I like to say is, you know, we make the judgment, and since most of us, if you're subsistence harvesting, you know, and that's the problem, and you have to do it, and then you're over harvesting and you're impacting your thing, then that means there's an imbalance there. And in the old days, people, who knows what they would have done. If you had to survive, they would have to survive. But if you have the choice to then go to the store in a lean year because there's not enough of a wild food that you usually depend on, or go and trade with somebody else from something where something's more abundant, or move in, we have the choice because we can move around. None of us are in this country, at least right now, are isolated enough that we have to harvest and over-harvest something that's in a lean thing or in a problem situation. So we always have the choice to go and pull off of our store-bought food or pull off of our things. But there's so many things that are abundant at least every 2 or 3 or 4 years where there's plenty that we can harvest and we can store it. You know, and so I think it's all just like, it's all an individual situation, and that's the whole thing around doing it. This is, it needs to be done. You can't put blanket rules on anything. It needs to be done in a
so individualized with the plant or
right
the animal too.
And in your individual situation, how much you're doing it. You know, feeding one person or a family of 2 or 3 is way different than trying to feed 15 people.
Or having a business where you're
or selling, and that's the biggest
selling
thing.
abalone.
Yeah, well, that's why it's illegal to do that. Like people are not allowed to do what they're doing when they're selling abalone. That's the reason why almost all the game things in California are not allowed to be sold. Is because that's the idea, is that if we keep it with sport, if we keep it where people are doing it for personal consumption, then they're not going to overharvest. But the minute there's a profit put on it, people will overharvest, because that's what humans do. I mean, so that's why I'm really supportive of it all. You know, and we've gone into this whole topic. It's interesting, though.
It's really awesome.
But it's you know, but it's always a question. I feel like everybody has to be making their own judgments on their own things, and you need to know, and I feel like it's important to know and respect why fish and game laws are how they are in your state, because that's one of the reasons why it's statewide, is it's by regional, because every region is different.
The land is so different everywhere you go.
Yeah, the land is so different, and even within a fish and game rules, it'll be, this is the rule in this area of the state, and that's because the biologists have set the rules, because they're seeing the impacts and they're trying to make it, and they call it management, but they're trying to do their best.
And we harvested some thistle yesterday, which is this particular thistle is invasive, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so there's a lot of opportunities to harvest things that the more humans engage and eat, the better it will be for bringing things back into balance.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. And the actual act of harvesting, even a lot of, so we have to remember that people have been heavily harvesting the ecosystem in Northern California for many, many thousands of years. And the plants actually co-evolved, I like to call it,
too. Yeah.
with people utilizing them. And so when people stop utilizing things that had been managed really heavily, like there was no, like in this part of California, they say there was no actual agriculture, but it really was a sort of like wild management that was really close to agriculture. And so it wasn't that they were tilling land and planting seeds from out, but they did move things around. You know, they would heavily manage wild populations of things. If there was already a stand, it would be maintained, you know, and so since that's not happening as much anymore, the land is not as abundant as it was before in what we wanted. We were creating it. We were people that have lived here before were burning. They were managing, and everything was much more abundant, and things were in a lot of ways more in balance and healthy for the balance that they were creating. And it was the way it had been for so long.
For the population of people.
For the population of people. I mean, the population in California that was being supported, quote, like technically without agriculture, even though I like to remind people there was a lot of management going on. People really knew what they were doing. It was incredible the number of people that were living here pre-contact. And it's mind-blowing when people hear the numbers.
The definition of agriculture is a funny thing too, because a lot of people like to say agriculture is the root of what's wrong, and I'm like, well, where are you putting a line saying this is when agriculture started? Like your idea that it's like straight rows of certain plant. It's like humans and the land are like intimately intertwined, or like not necessarily never separate.
Right. We're an animal that lives in the land, but now we are different than the rest of the animals, and that's what I like to talk about, because we're the only animal that depends on technology. And so we have the ability to alter our world more than other animals. But we can, I do totally believe that we have the ability to live in balance with the world surrounding us. It's harder and harder as our population is as dense as it is, and as disconnected as we get. But you totally, especially if you're doing it on a small scale with a small number of people in a large area of land, it's totally possible to do it.
Yeah.
And to do it in a way that's not being impactive.
There's something you said earlier about human use of tools and technologies. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Like I took a philosophy of technology class one time when I was in college, and like where technology itself is such an interesting thing to think about. Like a lot of people say, well, if we just get rid of technology, then we'll be fine. I'm like, well, I don't think you can be human without technology. I mean,
no, you can't.
Your spoon is technology.
Yeah.
The stick you use to do this thing is technology. I think there's a point where, and I talked to Bonia about this on her in the conversation we recorded for the podcast, about like where that line is drawn, and when you're exploring and actually using simple technologies in your everyday life, you really start to realize like at what point does it become something that can be bringing your relationship with the land out of balance. So I think promoting the use of simple technologies is just like reminding people that we can have, I mean, we have to.
Oh, no, we totally are. We cannot be human without the use of technology, and that's what I like to remind people. I mean, you got to remember that 1.5 million to 2 million years ago, we weren't humans yet. So by the time we were actually Homo sapiens, and where we are right now, by 40 or 60,000 years ago, which is when we were identical to how we are right now, the technologies being used by 40 to 60,000 years ago were already really advanced. And so, it's totally, you basically completely argue that humans have to use technology. It's a human existence.
Just to make fire.
Well, just even to, even be able to process food. Even finding a nut with a hard shell on it and picking up a rock and cracking that nut because you can't crack it in your teeth or you can't crack it in your fingers. That's a technology. Like picking up a rock and cracking something. And that was something that was being done millions of years ago, and that's something that some apes do. Like it's something that other animals do too, and in some regions they totally depend on being able to do that to get their main food source. It's not as common as as one would think, as with humans, but there's a one, I'm forgetting, it's an ape that has to get this palm nut, and there's some great footage that came out recently in one of the documentaries of showing this, the only way that this population can survive is they have to teach their young how to find the right rocks and the technique. It takes them about 5 years to learn it, to be able to break the nut, and if they don't learn it by the time they're 5 years old, they're not going to live, because that's the main source of their nutrition. But it's a really hard-shelled palm nut. And so and they're these tiny little monkeys that are having to pick up these big rocks, and they've developed that in order to survive. So I like to talk about, like, that's probably what our ancestors were doing 2 million years ago, in figuring out how to pick up rocks and doing all that kind of stuff, and so by the time we became humans, we were really advanced at using technologies. We had to have it because we were hunting with different tools. Like we don't have. We've developed, because of our brains and our hands that have these opposable thumbs, we've developed, we've existed with the use of technology for so long that if we were to take the technology out of the picture, we would not be able to survive. We don't have sharp teeth and claws to hunt animals with. Our brain is such a huge part of our existence, and our brain is what it is because we've used it to develop technologies. And our hands are such a huge part of our existence. And so a really long time ago, those things kept those things as the things we have in order to survive with.
And I think those technologies probably changed our biology over time, too.
Oh, absolutely.
But I worry about cell phones and the kinds of things now that we are becoming, even in one generation, completely dependent on for survival.
Oh, yeah. And that's with just the mental knowledge. And, and like, I love, one of the things I like to say is that people talk about how we have so much knowledge and we have so much information now, more, especially with the internet, we have it at our fingertips, right? And, and they're like, oh, we know so much more than we used to in the old days. But I like to point out, like, yeah, we have so much more knowledge, but we have much less wisdom, because the application of that knowledge and being able to put it into the future, past, like past, present, and future, that's where the wisdom comes in, is learning the lessons that were learned by generations before, and understanding the reasons that people, like, understanding, just respecting, like, they said to do it this way because there must have been some reason, something happened back then that made it, that we need to do it this way. And that's where the wisdom comes in. And you can't gain wisdom in just one lifetime.
And using the body on the land, like doing the process of hide tanning, for example, you could read as much as you can about it, and like reading you and Steven's book could be really helpful. But like, until you actually do it, or until you actually taste the food or whatever, it's really hard to fully know it.
Even observing doesn't give you the same thing as participating.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've never even observed it, it's even harder. If you've just observed it, you're getting a little bit more, but when you actually participate, then you're getting the intimate knowledge, and that's where you can develop wisdom. I said you can't develop wisdom in one lifetime. You can develop personal, individual wisdom, but true wisdom that's going to help, like, answer questions and give you, like, the tool base to work on, like, if some weird thing starts happening, like with climate change, some weird situation we've never run into before, or even before climate change, you have a weird year where, in your lifetime you've never experienced anything before. That's where the passing of stories down and passing of things from previous generations gives you the tools of, like, oh, this is what, this happened before, and this is what people do and this did in this situation, or, like, it's not always the total answer, but it helps give you more tools to work on. And people have been passing down what they know to their descendants forever. I mean, that's why we developed language, so we can do that. Mm-hmm. So we could communicate, and so we could make plans, and so we could do that.
I wanted to ask you, who were some of your teachers when you first started getting into learning this, and how has that influenced your process?
I'm super grateful for my teachers. I feel like they were really incredible individuals, are and were. I was 19 when I first got taken to my first skills gathering. I was, going to UC Santa Cruz, still a vegan, studying languages and different art things, and I met my partner for very long, who we've mentioned several times, Steven Edholm, and he took me to my first skills gathering. He had gone to one or two before by that point. He was 21, and I guess I should say I was hooked. My first skills gathering I went to was a one called the Glass Buttes Nap-In. It was a pretty unorganized, non-paying one that was organized by a man named Jim Riggs, and he's definitely one of my earliest teachers and one of my mentors, and he passed away a couple years ago. He was an incredible person, and the amount of knowledge that he transmitted to other people was huge. And so I recommend anybody trying to look up things about Jim Riggs. There's not a lot about him on the internet. He was a pretty big Luddite, and he was pretty old school, but he's had a huge impact in Western states on this whole skills community, and I'm really grateful to have had him as a friend and a colleague and, you know, a teacher at the beginning. And then the person who actually drove me, because at the time when we were going to our first gathering, we were on bicycles. We didn't drive cars. The person who actually drove me to my first gathering was Margaret Mathewson, and she's really my biggest teacher, you know, because we would take these trips to get to the gatherings with her. We'd ride our bikes from Santa Cruz to Berkeley where she was, and then we'd get in her car and take these meandering trips up to a gathering, and on the way harvest things and, you know, do things. So I feel like because of doing that with her, I was schooled. Really haven't hardly ever taken any classes, but I was schooled just in the sort of apprentice type thing, where just you're hanging out with people doing things. And, you know, like I processed materials for making baskets before I really even wove a fine basket, you know. And it was just like I spent a lot of time just like whatever she was doing, whatever she was harvesting, I would just do. And it wasn't that I had a end product in mind, or like I wasn't like I want to make this thing, you know. I wasn't taking a class. I was just learning the skills over and over, and was just helping her with whatever she was doing, you know, because she was teaching me. And then, you know, and that was a relationship that's continued till now, and she's definitely like one of my best friends, but also like biggest teachers.
I think that's an important thing too, slow down, and I see that a lot happening right now. People are like, I want to be a basket maker, or I want to be a person that carves spoons, or like I want to do this thing, and just jump right into trying to do it and make money off of it or something. But I think it's respecting the craft, but also it's just there's so much beauty in like taking your time, learning all the parts of the process and the connection to the land, you know, like learning about the willow and how it grows, or learning about, you know, hanging out with people who've been doing it for a really long time and like helping them, assisting them, you know, is a part of being able to do that.
Oh, it's a great way to learn. And you know, back in those days, this was a long time ago. I mean, this was almost 30 years ago, or over 30 years ago now, is there weren't as many people doing this stuff as there are now, and there weren't as many young people trying to get into it. And so, and you know, I feel like I was really fortunate in that I had a good place to live in Santa Cruz that didn't cost hardly any money, and I was just able to spend time. It had that property, had access to hundreds of acres that we could harvest on and explore. And so we were intentionally living a life that didn't cost very much money to live, and that was the dumpster diving thing, and the, you know, and scavenging, or like foraging a lot. And we were in a situation where we could dedicate our lives to that kind of thing, and then just like having the teachers who just were like, oh, well, just come help me do this. And since I didn't have the need to be creating a bunch of money, because I didn't have need of money at that point.
Have land to pay for.
I didn't have land to pay for like I do now. That I wasn't tempted to try to take that craft and immediately have it turn around and make something that would make money. And so I was in a unique, like a really, I mean, I'm grateful that I was in an opportunity to just explore craft and really like experiment, and just like that was what we were doing. We weren't trying to make money. We were just trying to learn. And, you know, I was fortunate. A lot of people aren't as fortunate to be able to do that. You know, I try not to judge people on whatever they do. Everybody's in their own situation. And I was really fortunate. Like, there weren't many people teaching at the gatherings then. And, I mean, I was only 19, and by the time I was 25, I was considered to be one of the elders, because I'd been going to the gatherings for 5-6 years at that point, you know, and it was like, and I'd been there since close to the beginning, you know. I think my first rabbit stick was the third rabbit stick, I believe, or the fourth or something. And so, you know, it's... And I feel so, and then by going to the rabbit stick gathering and going to Glass Buttes as well, then I met my other really big influences, you know. So for tanning, a huge influence was a man named Melvin Beatty. And he wrote, you know, he's talked about in the Buckskin book. And then, you know, Jim Riggs, of course, for tanning. But Mel did wet scrape brain tanning. Jim had taught dry scraping. And so Mel really did the wet scraping. And we picked his brain like crazy and got so much information from him.
Your book was focused on wet scraping.
Wet scraping, yeah. And our book was the first book about wet scraping. And that was really the first time that we, people have been offering us to teach classes, and we started teaching classes to make a living, but sort of barely making it. And then people were saying, you guys need to write something about wet scraping. And so that was, our first big attempt to like really sort of put something out there. And it's gone through 2 printings, and it's out of print right now, but I'm hoping.
I know, I need another copy. I lent mine out and it's gone.
But it's out of print because the printer destroyed our flats. And, so I'm in the process right now of re-outputting it digitally, which has been a challenge because I was in old technology. I don't like to stay current. And trying to do with digital printing now, I have to get into current technology.
You're pretty
to get it.
Computer savvy for...
Oh, computers have always, like, they've been easy for me to figure out. And it's sort of like, I call myself a technologist, and I'm not, but as much as I focus on the ancient technologies, the paleotechnologies, I'm just a technologist. I like to do things myself. And so, like, designing a website is creative and fun to me. Like, figuring out how to, like, print something. Like, and also, I had the advantage in high school and my first year in college. My uncle did lithography, and I worked at a printing, like a graphic design place. So I understood the old school production of printing and putting things together. And, I joke around, I was a stripper when I was in high school. That was the term for basically composing, taking photos and text and putting them together onto a printing plate. Like, you make these things called flats, and you put them onto a printing plate. And that's what I did in high school. And so, that was my job. And so I have sort of a background in just that whole thing. And that's all, since the time we printed the Buckskin book, that's all transitioned into fully digital now. And so that whole digital world is a little bit of a mystery to me. And I'm right now trying to upgrade my, buying a new computer that's good enough that it can run the modern programs. And because I was running off of a computer that was 12 years old until a year ago. So, it's just like, and everything was starting to not communicate with the internet anymore. And I finally was like, okay, I gotta invest in a new computer. So now I'm learning the new programs and that way, and the Buckskin book will be out soon. I'm on a handle of it now. I just have to do it now.
Tell me a little bit more about what the process was like putting that together. I mean, you were telling me in the past about like doing the plates, and y'all did all the drawings and stuff. It's amazing, like how much time and energy you put into it. Yeah,
that was right. It was such I don't have any children. And that, I always say that was my baby, like that. And it took a solid year of our lives, and it was a huge creative input. But it was also, we moved into town for the first time after being in the woods and being remote in order to be able to do the book. And this was pre-internet, really. Like, the internet wasn't even really started. And we moved into a room in my sister's house, and a friend gave us their old Mac Plus computer. So I don't know if anybody even really remembers
Mac
the early
Plus.
Macs. So they were like, when I first went to college, there was word processors, but the first computers were these tiny little boxes with a screen that was about like 5 inches tall and 6 inches wide. And if you have one of those Mac Pluses, apparently they're huge collectibles. But they were these tiny little box computers, and they were the first Macs, and they were a really big deal. And that was what we composed and laid out the first Buckskin book on. And there were even, so it wasn't even the little square discs. I don't even know if so before CDs, the media has been changing. There was this floppy disc, right?
But there were bigger floppy discs.
There were the thin, actual flexible floppy discs before that. And the first versions of the Buckskin book were on those. And in order to, and those held so little data that just the text, not the photos or the drawings, had to be on 3 floppy disks.
Oh my God.
In the file, just like the data. And, and so we were learning how to use a computer and try to do all this kind of stuff. And so what we did is we output all the text digitally on a program called PageMaker. It was like one of the first PageMakers, PageMaker 2 or something. And learned how to use PageMaker and use the editing program. And then all the drawings were drawn with rapidograph pens, huge size, and then shrunk down. And all the photos were just photos, and I sent them to my uncle who I'd worked for in high school, and he made they're called halftones, so they were shot with a camera through a screen in order to make a bunch of dots to be able to be printable. And so it was all film. And then we, and then he took pictures of the drawings as well and made them into film pieces. And then, everything was sent to the printer, and they composed them into these flats. They output all the text. And it was all pasted together like I used to do in high school. And we had this stack of printing flats, and that's what the printer destroyed. They did it without our permission, So I have to, that's why, all of the photos have to be rescanned, which I've done now, and all the drawings have to be rescanned. Fortunately, I have the originals of all of them, the original paper. And then the text is in. Fortunately, I upgraded it as the programs were going obsolete, so I did get the original PageMaker file into InDesign years ago, and I kept it in that. So, and my new InDesign does read that old file, which I was really happy about. Otherwise it was going to be like re-inputting all that text. And so now I just have to get it laid out and get the photos. I have to turn it into a digital file.
So that's going to take you a month or two, probably.
I'm hoping
Maybe
it'll be
just a
quicker. I have everything scanned. It's just a matter of compiling now.
Can people like get on a wait list or like prepay for the new copy to help you?
Yeah. If you place an order on my website, there's a chance to order it, and you're putting it on back order. And that money would really help because I'm running really tight right now.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if people can wait, I feel really bad. Some people have been waiting over a year. But it's almost here. And then and then I have my Patreon thing that I'm just starting, and that's one of the perks I'm giving for Patreon. Is part of the reason I haven't been working on it is I'm just barely covering my bills, and I put aside a few weeks to work on it, and then I'm really low on cash, and so I've got to do something else to make money instead. And so and then I don't do the book, and so I just launched the Patreon thing, and if I can get at least a couple $100 coming in a month, then I would be able to spend time on the book, because then I wouldn't have to be I could cover my bills a little bit, and I'm hoping to get it done this summer.
Are y'all going to upgrade any of the information in it too in the process of reprinting it?
That would take a whole other long thing.
That'd be another.
I think that it's a classic, and I want to keep it where it is. But the one thing I think that we're going to do is because we're going to output it digitally, so it's not just going to be the printed thing. So there'll be a digital version of it as well. Although it for sure is going to be printed, and hopefully in as good quality as the old one. That's why I'm searching for the right printer right now. That's a whole other thing too, because the old copy, we intentionally made it as a thing called the Smythsone book. So it's a paperback, but it's got a hardback binding on it. Mm-hmm. And so it's sewn together so the pages will never fall out, even if you leave it out in the rain or use it as a manual and get it all covered in.
People buying this book are going to be probably outside.
Yeah, and they're going to be using it when their hands are goopy, and we wanted it not to fall apart. And so I really would love to Smyth-sew the new edition, but with this digital printing, I don't know if it's possible. So that's why I'm in the process of communicating with printers right now to find out who we can do it with that way. But that's, Smyth-sewing is not something that's super common. And so it was even uncommon 15 years ago, and now or 20 years ago, and now it's even less common. So I'm trying to come up, if we can't Smyth-sew it, like coming up with what's going to be the other most durable binding we could do. So and find out if we can afford it. And then, but what we are going to do is for sure in the digital version, we're going to put hot links in, because the idea is that on the website we want to have more media and film and video and other things. And so we're going to have links that would go to things on the web that would be content that's getting updated always. So the idea is maybe each chapter would have a page on the website that would be more information. Mm-hmm. And then we can be working on that just as we have a lot of like films and a lot of like new things that aren't in the book mm-hmm. that can be added. And so I'm thinking that in the printed version, we'll probably just do a basic link to the index page for that, and say to see the the current digital available media that is supported by this or that takes this further, go to this link and it'll all be there. So I don't think the printed edition is going to be edited much.
Yeah. That makes sense too.
Yeah, it's I don't want to.
Y'all put so much into it, and
we did, and also we're divorced now, and so I don't know if we would work together.
To sit together in the room
long
and be
enough
like,
to be able to I don't know if it would be good for our relationship. Like we're amicable now. We have a pretty good situation, but I'm not sure if trying to revise the printing the Buckskin book would be a good thing.
Yeah, totally.
But adding more digitally, I think is a great idea.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So
he can add his stuff to it when he needs. Or
we can each add to it. We can each put in our own input, and we're not having to go through and hash through our old words and things.
You also print a lot of little zine chapbooks and smaller publications on other things. What's your process with that?
That I'm doing a bunch right now, and that's part of the thing like I said, on Patreon. So if people support me on Patreon on a higher level, I'll promise them a printed copy of the Buckskin book. and definitely digital copies as soon as it comes out. That'll help fund getting my time together to do it. But what I'm promising people on Patreon, if they're at the lower levels, is as I make these new handbooks, I'll make them available digitally, or I'll send them printed copies of them at the different tiers. But there's been 5 that have been out for a very long time, and one of the most popular copy. They're tiny little handbooks, and I'm just doing them at copy shops. So they're never in large runs or anything. But the most popular title is one that's called "So You Have a Dead Animal?" ? And
I have that one.
Yeah, it's a little red booklet. And a lot of people give me really good feedback. And that one was created years ago in response to, I'd be demonstrating, or I'd be having a craft fair, I'd be doing something like demonstrating a skill or having my display table out. And invariably at everything I went to, somebody would come up to me and say, so in my freezer I have such and such. Like they'd either picked up an animal, had an animal that had been killed, there was some story of some animal that for some reason they needed to figure out what to do with. And I realized the need of having, the Buckskin book was already out, so is it what to do with the skin and what to do with some of the sinews, and the Buckskin book has a whole thing on using parts in it. But it didn't talk about so much of what you do from the dead animal, the recently deceased animal, which if you just leave it there and you don't deal with it, becomes rotten really, really quickly. And there's this thing is, if you know what to do, you can get everything into a state of preservation that then you can deal with it all later. Mm-hmm. And so that's what that little zine is about. It's just how to take it from that thing that's perishable, that's going to become horrible to deal with really quickly, to, okay, everything's in a stable state and now I'm going to move forward with it.
Those are pretty fun and accessible because you have this small little thing you can just have in your backpack.
Yeah, you can keep it in your car. You can keep it. Yeah, it's Yeah. And I still get calls from people, and it's one of those titles that when people are walking by, they see it and it brings them into my booth. It's one of my best titles. Mm-hmm. It catches people's attention, and it was super fun. So, and I will expand on that one a little. That one was written almost 20 years ago now, and sometimes when I read it, I'm like, it's one of the things, I think when I get through a few more titles that I'm really in the process of writing, I might go through and revise the other ones. Yeah. But the other one is one that's called Sustainable Harvest. So it's all about the concepts we were talking about earlier, about harvesting mostly plants, but also animals, in a way that's going to promote their benefit, or promote their continued existence in a positive way. So even though you're utilizing them. It's just a tiny, short one, and that one I really want to expand on. That one has a lot of things I want to add to it, and but it's a great little book even as it is. And then there's one on sharpening tools that is mostly that Steven wrote it, but I edited it. It's on steel edges, and that one's a really good one. And then there's one that's called Using the Whole Animal, which is pretty much the handbook to my pig processing class, and that one has a lot of the recipes that I've come up with. Because when I was we sort of tapped on it earlier. When I was first teaching the classes, it was more like, this is how you process the animal, and now we have all of these organs to eat, and you just eat them, right? But I started, and I usually would just bread and fry everything. And then as I was doing the classes, I was like, wait, these are such amazing, nourishing things. Let's start researching. And this was right when sort of this nose to tail thing was starting. I mean, I think it was about 15 years ago. And I started looking for recipes and coming up with really amazing ways. And when you get into it, then you start going to the high-end chef stuff of this is the way I want to show this organ meat off. It's where it really is at its best.
Pate.
Yeah, pate is a good example. Or I love baking hearts with stuffed things inside of them, and then there's all these just ways of making everything come out. And so that's what I was just searching for, old traditional, and going back into every culture on earth. Most of the traditional foods, no matter where you are, Northern Europe, Africa, nowhere, South America, if you really go back to the traditional foods, if they're the not plant-based foods, if they're the meat-based foods, they're going to be involving organ meats. And so because they're super nourishing. And if you're a hunter-gatherer, you eat all that organ meat, because that's really almost giving you more nutrition than the meat itself. And it's a celebration. You've hunted an animal, you've successfully gotten food. And as a group, as a community, the organ meats are usually pretty perishable, so everybody feasts on those organ meats.
Right away.
And so those are the celebratory dishes, all of that kind of stuff. And so I just started looking back through old books and looking for old traditional things from all around the world, and came up with really good recipes that I put in there. of really good ways to cook these different organs. And so then, and then I started inviting chefs. People would want to take the class who had chef, it started just, I had a chef accidentally take a class once. And he just instantly was like, oh, if you cook this, it'll come out better. And I started realizing that I have a work trade position in the class now. So I always have a chef in the class helping people cook, because that's what we're doing. It's basically, we're processing an animal for 2 days, but we're cooking it and we're eating it. And we're getting super nourished.
Cooking foods that people can then recreate later is a really important part of, it was, when I was in Hawaii recently, we talked about that a lot. Like, you've got all these foods that have been culturally significant here, and like no one's really eating them. They're just going to the grocery store because they don't understand what to do with them. And it's like, well, you show people like you can make this really tasty thing with it. It helps people continue to.
Oh, absolutely. It's just like just with the wild foods, like, people, and with the like harvesting an animal, there's this. People, it's really interesting. I see it all the time, and I saw it in myself, is when something's foreign, even though it's all around you, if you just don't know what to do to make the leap to enter that world, it feels completely like it feels prohibitive, like you're never going to do it. So until you process an animal, you're like, I could never do that. Like, and then, until you've gone out and harvested a wild food, you feel like, oh, I'm scared, it might poison me, right? Or it might hurt me, or it might not be good, But then once you do your first thing, that opens the window. And then you start seeing things. You're like, oh, because usually when you do it, it becomes really logical. Because we got to remember, our ancestors figured this out. We all have the ability to do these things. Some people talk about things being in our DNA, like that we carry everything our ancestors did. And I feel like a lot of times when you're doing this, you're waking that up. And it just like, you're super surprised because it feels prohibitive and it feels like you could never do it. And the minute you move into doing it,
it feels good.
It feels natural, and you feel like you know what to do, and it makes sense. And and that's part of because we're all ruled by the same laws of physics. Like, it all works. It's, animals are put together in a way that's actually really commonsensical. And, like, we're packages, we're machines that work, if you want to call them that. We're not really machines, but we're mechanisms, we're organisms. And we're designed in a way, and, like, we just start looking at that, and that's where the science comes in. Like, I also like to tell people, all of our ancestors were the first scientists. Like, everything, all the technology is based in science. It's all on an understanding of the natural world. Like, we are ruled by this thing called physics, and we've been ruled by this thing called physics for our entire existence on this planet. And everything else on the planet is also ruled by the same rules and the same laws of physics. And so we're all working within this container, and that's why the skills are pandemic and universal, because there's only so many ways to do each thing. And everything, there's a reaction that happens when you do certain things. Like, when you twist fiber that's strong enough to twist, it binds energy and it reacts by twisting around itself. Like, that's a law of physics. And then we, a long time ago, saw that happening and went, oh, wow, this makes something that we can tie and untie more than just a wad of fiber. And, so it's observing those rules of physics, and then that's why all around the world people develop the same ways of doing things. And that's where the pandemics come in. It's so much science, and it's so much fascination, and it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter anything. Like, when you get into talking technology, you can get into some amazing conversations, because we are all the same.
Can you speak a little bit about cordage and fiber, which is something you also do a lot of, and maybe some of your favorite or plants that you use for that? I know that's like a big conversation to get into at the end of the
it's a huge one, but
recording, but maybe just your.
Well, here in North America, we're really fortunate to have a plant called dogbane. It's a unique plant. It only, as far as I know, grows in the wild natively in North America. It's in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world. We have there's nettles that are used all around the world. There's milkweed. There's very universal plants. The ones that were domesticated were hemp and flax all around the world a long time ago. And every other region of the world has a couple other plants too. But dogbane is our North American thing, and it's as good as hemp and flax. And we're really fortunate to have a native wild plant fiber that's amazing, and so that's primarily what I work with. And there's several large patches here in California that are managed, and it's so easy to process. And, there's a lot of tree barks I use and things like that too. I teach people about all of them, but what I primarily use is the dogbane. And it's, fiber arts is this whole thing. It's botany. It lets you understand how the plants are growing. Like, those fibers in that stalk of dogbane is the vascular system of the plant. It's like our circulatory system. It's the part of the plant that's keeping it alive, that's moving everything around its body. It's all these little tubes. And then what I like to say is just there's certain plants in every region that decided to build those tubes out of something strong. And you can extract those and make those into fiber. And that's learning the skill and how to do that. So it's a fascinating thing. And, that twist that I was talking about, that law of physics, one thing that blew me away about 10 years ago, I had a parent helping me in one of my school programs, and I was making cordage with the kids, and I do a 3-way version where they're really seeing the science behind it. They're in a triangle, everybody's twisting, they're creating the angle, so it's geometry, it's physics, there's all the science engaged in it, and it's all just to make a piece of string that they're going to put their beads that they've created on. And they're using hemp twine, not the dog mane, but they're twisting it. And a parent that was there happened to be a physicist of some sort, like I'm forgetting the word right now, but like a molecular physicist, I guess it's called. And she got really excited, and she was like, oh my gosh, do you realize that this is the perfect model for how our chromosomes are created by our DNA? And, that sort of blew me away. I was like, wow, it's, because it's this whole thing of bound energy holds things together. And so, it's this twist. Our DNA are these things that are twisting, and it's constantly twisting, and the energy is building, and they fold over, and they wrap themselves down. And they don't do like a long piece of string, but then they fold over again and go in a different direction. It's sort of this little bundle of a whole bunch of little cords. And apparently that's the building block of our chromosomes. And so I like to say that, string making goes down to a molecular level, and then I joke it goes up to a cosmic level with like string theory and stuff. But it's like, and I don't know for sure what string theory is, but I'm sure it has something to do with anything that's strong enough to hold energy is going to react. And that's what all of this is about. And so, it's a building block of life, essentially. And it's one of the most important skills that we need if we're going to tie things together, if we're going to make nets, if we're going to make rope, if we're just going to try to make something strong enough. And everywhere around the world, people figured out the fibers a very long time ago. Whatever plants in the region give them the fibers they need in order to make string. And even before you're making string, just a twist, and then basketry is all interconnected with string too.
Yeah, it kind of moves into that realm.
You move into fiber arts, and then cloths, any kind of that, any kind of woven thing. Paper even is a version of that. Felting is even a version. It's not the exact same thing, but it's all like acknowledging the strength of fibers in things, and making them into an entity that can be utilized to either clothe yourself or carry things or pull things together. It's one of the most ancient and core technologies. So, to finish it up, I think it's a good way to close is at the skills gatherings, they like to talk about the main big 3 things, like the things like that tree of technology. I was talking about the roots, but the 3 strongest roots that go back the longest, that really are what everything else came on. Because that tree's been growing for the last several million years, and now like we're up in the canopy, and we're in the leaves, and we're in the tips of the branches. But no matter what technology we use in our modern world, they all will go back down to the bigger branches, down to the trunk, and into the roots of the core stuff we figured out millions of years ago. It all came from there. If our ancestors hadn't figured out the original things, we wouldn't have anything we have in our world today. And that's sort of like the exploration of all of this. And that's where, if you know the technologies, you don't have to go to the hardware store and buy something that was created by a machine. You can go further back that branch and say, oh, hey, I can either grow this or, here on my farm or my homestead, or I can find this, or you can go, I can find this in the natural world if you go back further, and you can learn what you would do to create, because you're fulfilling a need with the thing you buy at the store. And the more you understand where things came from, the more you can fulfill that need yourself or with what's available. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to find something that's been made out of plastic. You can utilize the technologies to use all these plastics too, but like you can just go back and make your choices, and it's not that the older technologies are always better for your situation, but you have the ability to make the choice. And so it just makes you feel less dependent on a mechanized system of existence like most people feel like they are. And the core 3, the other thing that everything depends on, is the ability to make and utilize fire, the ability to make and utilize fiber, and the ability to, like extract and utilize fiber, I guess you could say, and the ability to create a cutting edge. Like without those 3, you don't have anything else. And those are the ones that are involved in everything that grew out of them. Mm-hmm. So those are the first 3 that people need to explore. And those are what I try to focus on in my programs with kids.
The pandemics.
Yeah, the pandemics. Those are the main core pandemics. And then the next one is clothing yourself. So tanning and things come into that. But so does the fiber arts. Goes into that direction too. And then gathering foods, it all starts building. But without those other 3, really, those are the ones that are utilized in the other technologies the most, if anything.
Where can people find you online? Because you do have online presence.
I just my website, because of my old computer, had died or just been sitting there for a couple of years. It's finally been revamped. It's Paleotechnics.com, and I'm excited about it. It's really functioning, and hopefully it's working. If anybody goes there and finds a bad link or something that doesn't work, like, I love feedback, because I'm trying to figure out the new program. But it's Paleotechnics.com.
We'll put it in the show notes too.
Okay, yeah, and
Good.
thank you.
Yeah.
And then there's also a blog that I haven't been updating that I hope to start doing more.
Is that linked through that website?
There is a link off the website, and then there's the Patreon. It's Paleotechnics on Patreon.
Cool.
So those are my sort of 3 web presence things. And then there's an Instagram and a Facebook. The Facebook page, just announces upcoming events and things that are happening, or I like to share things that colleagues are doing as well, so just people can know what's going on. Because we're a community of people. We're an extended village of people that meet up at the gatherings, and we've known each other. I mean, some of these people I've known for 30 years now. I've watched some people be born, and now they're teaching. And, it's pretty amazing. So.
Cool. Well, thanks for sitting down with me at your place and chatting for a little bit and sharing about all of this stuff. I feel like each one of those topics could have been its own podcast episode too, like the animal processing of fiber.
Oh yeah, that's one of the things about. I joke, I can give you a 1-hour overview on something, or a 2-hour overview. It's hard for me to do 1 hour, but 2 hours. I can give you a day class in it, a weekend class, or a week-long intensive in any topic you want. So, and that's just because it's fun to explore things and take things to different levels,
It's cool to kind of dip and bridge some things together too, within all this.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me to do the podcast.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey y'all, you just listened to a conversation with Tamara Wilder on the Ground Shots podcast. I wanted to mention that the music for this conversation is Mother Marrow's new version of Sweat and Splinters, which is the theme song for the podcast. I recently got to go visit Asheville, North Carolina, where I used to live and farm, and I visited Charity, who is the main person in Mother Marrow, and now she has a really amazing band, and I got to see Mother Marrow play live, and it's been a really long time since I've seen Charity play, but it was so wonderful to land there and go to her show and see friends and see where her music has gone. And Charity and her band recorded an album finally after all these years of music making professionally this summer, so you can buy their album online on Bandcamp or on her website, and that's been in the show notes on every episode. So please go check it out, and I hope you enjoyed that new version of Sweat and Splinters. It's pretty magical, and thanks for listening, y'all. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.